Over a decade ago, Mark Fields and I had what was in my professional ministry life a pivotal moment. I have been providing care for cross-cultural workers full-time since 1995 when I left my private practice. And God called me to be part of reaching the remaining unreached peoples in the world. And so when Mark and I met in early 2000, I was at a place where I realized that spiritual health of workers was one of the greatest needs that I was encountering. Yes, there were people with crisis and trauma and need for debriefing and for support and training. But as we talked, we had this vision, and our friend Steve Summerell, who I think might be with us here or joining, also was in that discussion, to say, what if we focus on the spiritual well-being of leaders as a way of developing leaders, supporting leaders, and make that a foundation of what we do in Vineyard Mission. And so we have been doing that. And so Mark's going to be sharing from his wisdom from those times subsequent to that and up till today in terms of why soul care and mission go together. So let's all mute out and turn our videos off, and I'm going to turn it over to Mark. And Mark, welcome and thank you so very much for coming to share with us tonight.
Thanks so much. I was muted, so I had to get that fixed. I'm happy to be here and to share a little bit about what I've learned. The question that I want to try to answer, which is hopefully the one I was assigned, is why give attention to my soul when my focus is on mission? So those two tend to be contrasted with each other and sometimes, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. But why give attention to that? Now, I've taught on this topic before, but for this evening or afternoon for me, I went back to the beginning and I thought about, okay, what have I really learned in the last 15 or so years? And what do I believe is important? And about why soul care matters to mission. And I've just had some real breakthroughs in my own understanding and my own practice of the disciplines. And so I want to share a couple things really as a backdrop before I address the why. And so I've been thinking recently about the Dallas Willard definition of the purpose of spiritual disciplines or exercises in our life. And Willard says that disciplines are activities within our power that enable us to accomplish what we cannot do by direct effort. And so disciplines are our active participation in our spiritual growth, and they open us up to God's gracious action in our lives. Now, it's important to remember that they're the preparation for the race, not the race itself. And I'm thinking of the language of Paul here in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Let me read this. Don't you realize that in a race, everyone runs, but only one person gets the prize? So run to win. All athletes are disciplined in their training. They do it to win a prize that will fade away, but we do it for an eternal prize. So I run with purpose in every step. I am not just shadow boxing. I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself might be disqualified. And so a couple of the practices of my life, like the Jesus prayer, is not an end in itself. The goal is that I learn to pray without ceasing. Or I practice in the evening the prayer of examine, reflecting on God's work and activity throughout the day. The goal is that I begin to see God at work in real time, not just at the end of the day when I formally reflect on it. So every morning I get up and I exercise. I exercise physically and I exercise spiritually. Now you may notice hanging on the wall behind me is a shell. And you may or may not know what that is, but that's the symbol of the Camino de Santiago, which is a 500-mile walk from France across Spain. And 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago, Steve Summerell and Craig Goodman and I did that walk. Now, in anticipation of that walk, I began to exercise because I realized that I was not going to be able to walk with that level of intensity day after day after day without some preparation. Now, as it turns out, I had a number of injuries and it was much more challenging than I imagined. But I began for a year in advance to work with a trainer. And so 3 times a week, Karen and I would go to a gym, and there was a person who taught me how to do the exercises correctly, how to figure out how many exercises to do, when to stop, which exercises to do. And I learned some really valuable lessons about the importance of a trainer for physical exercise. I've never been one that exercised a lot. I went into the Navy when I was 17, and that was probably the peak of my physical ability until I began to get in shape to pursue that shell on the wall there. The same thing is true in the spiritual disciplines. So I realized that as of April this year, I have been meeting with the same spiritual director for 12 years. And in the process, I've learned a huge amount from him. And he's taught me about different disciplines. He's walked me through changes in the disciplines I practice. He's helped ensure that I do them in a right way. And I have just learned the value of a trainer in both the kinds of exercise that I participate in every morning, physical exercise and spiritual exercise. Now, one of the revelations I've had lately, and which I talked to my spiritual director about last month, is I'm realizing how many of the spiritual disciplines have layers in which they impact us. And so at first I thought these were simply spiritual exercises, but I've begun to realize that they really do impact the whole of who we are. And so normally on Thursdays I fast. Now I didn't today because I didn't want to be thinking about food when I was trying to talk to you, if I'm honest. So today I did not do it, but normally on Thursdays I fast. And what I've learned is that fasting has a number of lessons for us. One of those is I began to realize how to deal with unsatisfied desire. On Thursdays, my desire to eat does not go away. In fact, amazingly, sometimes it feels even more intense than it is on the days when I know I'm going to eat. And I can have days where I'm watching that clock and knowing when the time comes that I can eat. And my desire is more, not less, but I learn to deal with that unsatisfied desire. Now, I was thinking about this, and I remembered the verse in James, where James, the brother of Jesus, speaks about the causes of conflict. And he says there, what is the source of conflict among you? What is the source of your disputes? Don't they come from your cravings that are at war in your own lives? You long for something you don't have. You are jealous for something you can't get, so you struggle and fight. Might it be possible that one of the things that God's training us in as we do the spiritual discipline of fasting, which is one of those core spiritual disciplines, is to deal with unsatisfied desires in more helpful ways so that, among other things, it actually reduces conflict so that I'm not fighting when I don't get everything I want. In fasting, I learn to remain calm and serene and strong even when deprived, that it isn't an excuse for being upset because my blood sugar is lower. On fasting, I learned that God meets our needs in his own ways. That's one of the interesting things about the statement of Jesus as he's tempted, and it's recounted in Luke 4, where he says that people do not live by bread alone. And fasting liberates us into the abundance of God. And for that reason, it's a core spiritual practice that affects many areas of our lives. Now, I also have contemplative practice that I do every day, and that is the Jesus prayer. And I've realized that what happens through that is not just what happens in those 30 minutes. I learn to focus my attention on one thing, one person. Now, that does not come easy to me. I have a mind that is moving very rapidly. If I'm bored for a minute or a conversation languishes, it's very easy for me to be somewhere else. And that happens when I sit in my chair over there before God each morning in practicing the Jesus prayer. But part of what I learn is that I learn to focus my attention. And over time, I've gotten better at giving that attention to God, to be present with God and receive his grace. Another thing that it does is it cultivates self-awareness. I begin to notice what are the thoughts and the kinds of thoughts that intrude on my prayer time. And I become aware of that. In the Eastern Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, spiritual direction has a more focused content than it typically has in the West. And the focus there is often on one's thought life, not the confession of necessarily sinful thoughts, but those things that draw one's attention. And so, for example, John Climacus, a monk writing in the 7th century, records that he observed monks actually walking around with a writing device and papyrus to write down their thoughts so that they could bring them to their spiritual director. And so I learned to give my attention to God, to be present with him, to focus there. It cultivates self-awareness. I learned the practice of setting aside my thoughts and returning my focus to God, of handing those over to God, the concerns that well up, and setting those into God's hands as I focus my attention for that 30 or 40 minutes with him. You may know the name Daniel Goleman. He's a psychologist. He wrote a book now, gosh, almost 25 years ago that was quite impactful at the time and remains a good seller, entitled Emotional Intelligence. And he argued that emotional intelligence has several components to it and that it's really more important than IQ in determining things like even health or financial success. And one of the components that Goleman talks about, emotional intelligence, is cognitive control. Learning to focus my attention, to choose to take it off of that and put it on this at will. And there are numerous benefits to that he catalogs. So I'm learning in new ways. I'm quite excited about it, actually. And just how much the things that God does, especially around that core set of spiritual values that seem to show up again and again and again in church history, are really things that train us on multiple levels. And why, it will come up in a minute when I talk about, as I'm about to do now, how this does impact mission, why a commitment to care for my soul impacts mission. So let me give you kind of 3 major reasons. Number 1, we have heightened sensitivity to the work of God. That's traditionally called discernment. Discernment is about distinguishing the work and the words of God from everything else. And it happens in 2 primary areas. One is in us. And we begin to be sensitive as our voice is silenced, so that our mind is silenced, so that our heart is silenced, so that our spirit is silenced, so that we're able to hear God's Spirit, and we can hear his challenges and we can experience his invitations. The place that it affects us in mission is that as I become used to hearing and recognizing and noticing and obeying and responding to the invitations of God in my own life, in the inner life, I begin to recognize those in the world around me. And one of the areas where that's made the most difference for me personally is there's a little statement that Jesus makes in John chapter 7, verse 24. And he's recorded as saying there, stop judging by mere appearances, but instead judge correctly. Now, I don't want to go through the whole story, but a few years ago, I found myself in an interesting spiritual environment. And it was named as a Christian environment, but the spectrum of people's understanding of what that word Christian means was much broader than mine, shall we say. And so there were things happening there that I was very uncomfortable with. Not everybody was a Christian. It was a very interesting environment. And just between you and me, I had judged a number of people. I looked in that room and I thought, these are the people that are opposite end of the spectrum from me. And if I were to describe them to you, you would understand why. But because this is going to be publicized, I don't want to do that. And so I remember thinking, well, those are the people that I'm a little cautious about, that I'm not sure I want to be around, that they understand spirituality very differently than I do. It's a little uncomfortable. Again, some of the things that they were doing were not things that I would feel comfortable at all doing, certainly not endorsing. But by the end of that week, it amazes me. I had spent time with each of those 3 people, and they had wept in my presence as we talked about the work of God. And I realized that the utter inappropriateness of my imagining that I could clearly discern what God was doing in someone's life without God being involved. And I hope I never forget that lesson. I hope I always remember the words of Jesus, because I looked at the outside. I looked at the things they said. I looked at the way they described themselves. And I thought, these people are not the ones in whom God is working. And as it turned out, they were. And I still remember so vividly the power of the conversations that I had that made it really clear to me that God was deeply at work in their lives and working hard to draw them closer to him. And this brings me to the accusation that sometimes comes up that contrasts, maybe out of the Mary Martha story from the Synoptic Gospels, formation with mission. And so one of the things that I hear sometimes, I get asked about, well, isn't that just navel gazing? And that whole phrase, navel gazing, is an interesting one, and I won't go into the depth of it, but it comes out of the accusations of a representative of the Roman Catholic Church in the West who had traveled to the East and was meeting with the Hesychasts, who were during the Hesychast revival of the 14th century. And so as he saw these monks with these variety of practices, he began to criticize them for their theological beliefs, some of which were reflected in their practices. And at that time, it was tradition during that Hesychast revival to focus on the physical dimensions of doing the Jesus prayer. It wasn't just the repetition of them or using a prayer rope to do that. They were doing a lot with synchronizing it with one's breath, and particularly having a particular posture in which they would do the Jesus prayer. And it was one in which their head was bowed over, and they were essentially looking at their abdomen. And out of that came the idea that they were navel gazing. And now that comes back without really understanding the context of those statements as kind of an accusation that it's either mission or formation. And my observation out of now 15 or more years of significant commitment to giving attention to my soul and my relationship with God is I'm convinced that when someone doesn't find that formation draws them to mission, they simply have not gone deep enough. You cannot touch and be touched by the heart of God that loves this world enough to send his son to die and be touched by that heart and not engage in inviting others to know him. I just don't believe that that's possible. So I see no conflict. I see an inability or not having had enough time to really to touch and allow one's heart to be touched by the God who loves this world that he created. Now, my second reason is really 3 in 1, so I'm cheating a bit here. And they all happen to have an I word, and they are actually integrated together in some way, and that is the first one. And I believe that what a focus on my soul care brings is, first of all, an integration in my life. I've been impacted a lot by Orthodox spirituality. I've studied it quite a lot. I've been around those folks. And one of the things that they talk about is one of the movements of spirituality in the Eastern Church is the movement of the head to the heart. Now, I think that tells us at least 2 things. One of those is that the priority is the heart above the head. The head moves to the heart, not the heart to the head. And so the head needs to adjust to what the heart is. And it's been an interesting process for me as someone who's pretty cognitively oriented to come to the conclusion that my heart is more trustworthy than my head. Even in saying it now, after all these years, I want to hedge that a little bit, but I believe that. Even more important, or at least as important, is that there's an integration into a whole. And I was talking with someone about this a while ago, and I realized that I cannot remember the last time that I said to someone, or I thought, my heart says this, but my head says this. What God wants from us is an integrated life, not a separated life. And the ramifications of that are far beyond what we have time to do today. But it's easy for people to to break off sections of their life and leave their life untouched by the deep work of God and live differently in different arenas of their life. But a commitment to soul care doesn't allow that to happen. Now, last week I was in Texas on vacation. It was our first trip coming out of COVID. We went to visit our daughter and her family, had a wonderful time with our granddaughter who's 3, who we hadn't seen, in face to face in the flesh, only on FaceTime for a year and a half. And as we were flying back, I listened to a podcast that I find interesting at times called Very Bad Therapy. And they were interviewing someone to talk about pastoral counseling. And I was curious to hear how they would describe pastoral counseling and what bad pastoral counseling would look like. And to my surprise, the person that they brought on the show to talk about bad pastoral counseling, I did not know her, but I knew the pastor that she was talking about. And it was a little bit embarrassing as it began to dawn on me. I know who she's talking about. And I remember that story, and I remember the email that I got about it. And it was quite devastating for her. And the problem is the person involved was able to separate parts of their life. They had not experienced the integration that spending time with God in around my soul brings. So that one of the things, a second thing that it brings is integration. Now, what that leads to, as I've already implied, is it leads to my second I word, and that's integrity. I'm watching the movement, mainly in this country, although I am seeing it in some other parts of the world that are affected by Western theologians, for deconstruction. And to my surprise, there are actually people who, including some former Vineyard pastors, who put themselves out as deconstruction coaches. And they will help you deconstruct your belief system. And I'm kind of fascinated by this, and particularly by watching a few people who seem to be finding their way back to God after a deconstruction of their faith. But one of the most interesting things to me is how many people are mad at the church and then blame God. And they're mad at the church because the actions of people who are pursuing God don't match the expectations or their own statements. Their words and their works don't match. And that's what integrity is about those things matching. And it has long stood out to me. A favorite part of the book of Acts is the very first verse of the very first chapter, in which the writer says that he's recording the things that Jesus did and Jesus said. And it occurs to me that the power of Jesus's message is that he did not say one thing and do another, that what Jesus said and what Jesus did gave the same message. And that's what I believe integrity brings. And then my third I is influence. And I've spent a lot of time this last week thinking about this verse from Matthew 5, and it's one that will no doubt be familiar to you. And I'm going through and I'm looking again at some of the missional statements of Jesus. Perhaps like you, I'm spending quite a lot of time in the Gospels. I'm mainly there and in the Psalter. I heard an Orthodox theologian once describe the Psalter, the Psalms, as the prayer book of Jesus. And so I thought, I want to be praying from the same prayers that Jesus prayed. And I'm quite touched and fascinated by being able to do that. But I'm going back and looking at the missional statements of Jesus. And this is one of those. It appears early, and it's in Matthew chapter 5, and you'll probably recognize it from the Sermon on the Mount. But here is what Jesus says. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. I have thought a lot about that. What is it that allows a person to live in such a way that people observe their good deeds and don't think, here's simply an altruistic individual, here's simply a kind person, here's someone who's a nice woman or a generous man, but here is someone in whom God has worked deeply enough that when they see our good works, they glorify the Father. I think that comes out of the integration and the integrity that follows that, and a consistency of life in which the way that we live brings glory to God by our light shining in the consistent, small, repeated, relentless little activities of love and care for other people. So those are my second thought about that. And finally is resilience. Now, resilience has mattered a lot these days in this time of COVID and all of the things that we're facing because of that. And you might remember that resilience is that capacity to return to the original shape after something has been bent or twisted or bound up. It returns to the original shape. And the truth is, life is difficult and ministry is more so. And resilience comes out of the capacity of God working in my life, that I can trust, among other things, that regardless of how well I can see it, or whether I ever have the question that dogs us of why answered, that God is at work. And I can find ways to resist the temptation to blame God and step away, but step towards him. And as I watch people, as we're starting to emerge from this season of COVID, I'm making some tentative observations that I find interesting. And one of those is I notice that the people who've pushed back the most, wanted to get out of this, wanted to stop it, wanted to push back against the restrictions and the limitations in their life, they end up bruised. But those that have discovered the capacity that comes with soul care and spiritual formation is the ability to accept that God is at work in this, regardless of whether I see it or not, regardless of whether I like it or not, regardless of whether I choose it or not, to do, in the words of some spiritual writers, to give consent to what I haven't chosen, who have accepted and adjusted. They have flexibility. And it appears to me, based on my observations, that they are emerging much more resiliently, with much more resilience and less bruised and less hurt than those that haven't. So I believe the spiritual exercises are preparation for life. They aren't life. They're, in the words of Dallas Willard, doing the things that I can do so that I will be able to do the things I cannot do in the moment where the real testing comes. And as I do it, it brings to me a sensitivity. I understand how God works. I'm surprised how many times in my own life, and as I listen to others, what I'm thinking is, that sounds like God, that doesn't sound like God. I have a big library. You can't see it here in the dark, but all these walls are covered with books, and I've read most of them. But that kind of knowledge doesn't come from a book. It comes from spending time with God and beginning to recognize with consistency the way God works in my life and the way God works in other people's lives. And so there's a sensitivity that develops. As I recognize God's work in my life, I'm able to see it in other lives. And as I see it in my life, I'm able to see it in the world around me. And I'm able to move beyond what, at least for me, is the huge temptation to judge by what I see on the outside, and recognize that God works in deeper places. And that ties directly to our capacity to join God in God's mission. It comes in bringing integration of the parts of me together, which results in integrity and then gives influence. And it results in the resilience that's really necessary to see fruitfulness in ministry. So those are my observations today. I hope they're helpful, and I'm learning a lot, and I continue on the path.